My fiancé gave me a public ultimatum to accept his ex-girlfriend as permanent family. So I ended the engagement at dinner, canceled the vendors, and changed the locks before he even got home. I officially canceled my wedding, dismantled my entire future, and kicked my fiancé out of my house after he flat out told me he would never cut his ex-girlfriend out of his life because of their deep history. The text message that started the final collapse lit up his phone screen while we were in the middle of a stupid, mundane argument about takeout containers. Julian had left them on the living room coffee table again, a greasy monument to his laziness. I had simply asked him to throw them away, and he reached for his phone with the heavy, exhausted patience of a man who apparently believed that basic household chores and my emotions were coordinated personal attacks against him. I wasn't trying to read his screen, but the preview notification was right there, glaring in bright white text. "Are we doing your dad's birthday dinner the usual way this year?" It was from Chloe, his ex-girlfriend. I just looked at him, my stomach tightening. "Why is she asking you about your dad's birthday dinner?" I asked, my voice dangerously level. Julian sighed, locking the phone and tossing it onto the sofa. "Because she always comes, Maya. You know this. We had been together for 5 years. He had lived in my house for 3 of them, and we had been engaged for almost a year. I bought this place entirely on my own before I ever met him, after working ridiculous, grueling hours at an architecture firm in downtown Chicago. I survived on cheap ramen, stale coffee, and sheer willpower for most of my 20s to afford it. The century-old oak floors were uneven. The vintage kitchen cabinets never closed properly without a hard shove, and the heavy wooden back door stuck stubbornly whenever it rained. But it was mine. It was my sanctuary. When Julian moved in, I cleared out half of my walk-in closet, gave him the larger drawer in the master bathroom, and tried my absolute hardest not to notice how quickly his things became ours, while the mortgage, the maintenance, and the mental load of responsibilities stayed almost exclusively mine. None of that bothered me enough to name it at the time. He bought groceries occasionally, handled the yard work when he actually remembered, and he could make the old house feel incredibly warm just by singing off-key while making breakfast in the kitchen. I genuinely, foolishly believed we were building a solid, shared life. The wedding felt like the next obvious, beautiful step, not a desperate rescue attempt or a ticking deadline. That was part of why Chloe's message confused and irritated me so much. I didn't think I was competing for him. I thought the competition had ended years before I even arrived on the scene. But Chloe had been lurking in the background from the very beginning. She appeared like a ghost at his mother's retirement lunch, neighborhood summer cookouts, holiday brunches, and even extended family trips. She had dated him for 4 years before me, and their breakup had supposedly been so incredibly friendly and mutual that both of their families collectively decided absolutely nothing needed to change. At first, I told myself that everyone was just highly emotionally evolved. I had dated people before him and still spoke occasionally to one former partner, so I understood that a breakup didn't require a scorched earth policy. But occasional, polite contact wasn't the same as asking about intimate family traditions like she was still the vice president of the planning committee. I asked Julian whether he thought it was strange that she was texting him about his father's birthday. He sighed heavily before I even finished the sentence. "Maya, we've talked about this 100 times, our families are close." "I didn't ask anyone to stop being close," I replied. "Then what exactly are you asking?" He snapped. I hated that question. I had spent years pretending I didn't need a clear, firm boundary just to keep the peace. "Why does she still act like she's part of your immediate family?" I asked. "Because everyone is mature enough to handle it," he said smoothly. Mature. That was his family's absolute favorite word. In their world, mature meant nobody had to feel uncomfortable except for me. Mature meant his ex could show up everywhere, insert herself into every milestone, and if I reacted with even a hint of discomfort, I was labeled insecure and jealous. I told him I wasn't trying to start a fight. He scoffed and said I had already started one. Then he picked up the greasy containers and carried them into the kitchen with exaggerated, theatrical patience, while I sat on the couch feeling jealous, embarrassed, and deeply annoyed at myself for feeling jealous. Every single time something bothered me, I put my own discomfort on trial. Was I being controlling? Was I too sensitive? Was I projecting my own insecurities? By the time I finally reached a verdict, everyone else had already moved on, and I was left apologizing for the tone of a conversation I had barely been allowed to have. He came back into the living room, kissed the top of my head dismissively, and said, "You're the one I'm marrying." I wanted that to be enough, so I nodded and let the subject die. That was my special, tragic talent in that relationship, mistaking the end of a conversation for the actual resolution of a problem. A few weeks later, his parents hosted a birthday gathering for his father, Robert. It was supposed to be a simple backyard thing, which in his mother Sylvia's world still meant professionally folded linen napkins, handwritten calligraphy place cards, and enough catered food to feed a small army. Chloe arrived half an hour early, carrying a homemade casserole and 2 expensive bottles of wine. She kissed Sylvia on the cheek, bear-hugged Robert, and walked straight into the kitchen without ever needing to ask where anything went. She knew exactly which vintage cabinet held the silver serving dishes, where the extra bags of ice were kept in the garage freezer, which aunt strictly drank decaf coffee, and which cousin had a deadly allergy to onions. Meanwhile, I was still being gently reminded by Sylvia which guest bathroom I was allowed to use. Chloe laughed loudly with Sylvia over some old inside joke while Julian looked visibly relieved that everyone was getting along. I stood by the kitchen island, feeling like the only person in the room who hadn't been given the script. Sylvia noticed me watching them and approached me with that gentle, condescending expression she used whenever she was about to correct someone while trying to sound compassionate. Sylvia had been a licensed family therapist before retiring, and every single disagreement or moment of tension with her somehow magically transformed into a clinical lesson. "Is everything okay, Maya?" she asked, tilting her head. I said yes, then foolishly added, "It's just a bit unusual for me." "What is?" I glanced toward the patio where Chloe was currently pouring wine for Julian's uncle. How involved she still is. Sylvia smiled her signature therapist smile. Maintaining deep affection after a romantic relationship ends can actually be a beautiful sign of emotional maturity, Maya. Not every bond has to become hostile just because the romantic element has concluded. I agree with that, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I just think there is a distinct difference between staying friendly and still being treated like a daughter-in-law. Robert joined us then, putting a heavy hand on my shoulder, and cheerfully added that the two families had been close for decades. Their parents had vacationed together in Florida, attended funerals together, and shared countless holidays. Cutting anyone off, Robert declared, would mean choosing sides, and we just don't do that. No one was asking them to cut off Chloe's parents. Still, they had already chosen a side. They had simply decided that my discomfort was rude and unevolved. Julian walked in, heard just enough to understand the topic of conversation, and immediately changed the subject to baseball. Robert went to check the grill. Sylvia offered me a condescending top-off of wine. The moment permanently closed before I could say anything useful. My own parents were there too. During dinner, my mother sat quietly, watching Chloe sit directly beside Sylvia, effortlessly pass plates around, and laugh uproariously before Robert even reached the punchline of an old joke. On the long drive home, my mother finally broke the silence. "Well, that was a little strange," she murmured. Julian had driven separately because he wanted to stay behind and help clean up, so I was riding home with my parents. I asked my mom whether she thought I was overreacting. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know enough about their dynamic to say for sure, Maya, just make sure you can actually talk to him about this." I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "That's the whole problem, Mom." By the time my parents dropped me off at my house, Julian had already made it home and changed into his comfortable sweatpants. I told him my parents had noticed how uncomfortably close Chloe still was to his family. He rolled his eyes so hard I thought he might strain something. "So now your parents are involved in this imaginary drama." "They were there, Julian. They have eyes. Your mother has never liked my family," he shot back defensively. That was a blatant lie. My mother had spent the last 5 years bringing thoughtful, expensive host gifts, meticulously remembering everyone's birthdays, and enduring Sylvia's obnoxious habit of psychoanalyzing everyone over dessert. But he was already throwing up his defensive walls, and I was just so bone-tired. He told me he absolutely did not want this becoming a big issue before the wedding. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, thinking it already times a massive issue. I just hadn't quite understood yet that I was the only person in the entire dynamic expected to keep treating it like a small one. Update 1. The wedding was scheduled for early fall, so the miserable months leading up to it became a blur of vendor contracts, guest lists, expensive food tastings, and exhausting arguments cleverly disguised as logistics. Sylvia and Robert were paying for a large portion of the reception. At the time, I was incredibly grateful. Later, I came to understand the hard way that money can be presented as a gift while still coming with two firm hands gripping the steering wheel. Sylvia completely took over the seating plan because she claimed to understand the delicate family dynamics better. I was working 12-hour days at the architecture firm, desperately trying to prepare a massive proposal for the historical restoration of a beautiful, crumbling 1920s Art Deco building downtown, so I foolishly let her handle it. Our wedding planner, a sharp woman named Claire, invited us to review the final venue layout at a local coffee shop. Julian arrived 20 minutes late and spent the first 10 minutes answering work emails on his phone while I reviewed the table arrangements. And then I saw it. I saw Chloe's name. She was seated squarely at the main family table, right beside Julian's aunt and directly across from Sylvia and Robert. "Why is she sitting there?" I asked, tapping the paper. Claire looked at Julian. Julian looked up at the ceiling, heavily exhaling. "My mother placed her," he said flatly. "Did you know about this?" I demanded. "I knew she was invited, Maya." "That isn't what I asked, Julian." He paused. Over the years, I had learned that Julian's pauses were usually the exact places where the truth went to hide. I didn't think it would be a big deal, he finally muttered. I pushed the layout blueprint across the table toward him. She is sitting closer to your parents than I am. You're at the head table, Maya, you're the bride. Exactly, and she is your ex-girlfriend. Why is she being publicly presented to all our guests as immediate family? He aggressively rubbed his forehead. Can we please not do this here? We could never do it at home because he was too tired, at his parents' house because it would embarrass them, or in public because it was inappropriate. Apparently, every single location on planet Earth was unsuitable for discussing the massive problem that followed us absolutely everywhere. Claire, trying to save the meeting, gently suggested moving Chloe to a table with longtime family friends. I thanked her. Julian immediately shot it down. No, we should leave it as is until I speak to my mother. It is our time's wedding, I said, my voice rising, and she is paying for part of it, yes, but it is our day. There it was. The clean, ugly truth of our dynamic. I reminded him of a family trip we took 2 years earlier. I had been waiting for formal approval to take time off from the firm, and Sylvia had warned me there might not be room in the rental house if I confirmed late. Chloe was already fully included on the guest list. When I finally got the time off and went, Chloe had the luxurious main guest room because she had confirmed first, while I spent a week sleeping on a lumpy futon beside a broken, rattling fan. Julian looked at me with pure disdain and said I was collecting incidents. I'm collecting them because there are incidents to collect, Julian. He looked at me like my very existence was exhausting him in real time. I told him I would raise the issue at the dinner our parents were having the following week. He begged me not to turn the dinner into an intervention. I told him I didn't want an intervention, I wanted an answer. He called me dramatic and stormed out of the coffee shop. I wish I could say I cancelled everything right then and there. Instead, I sat there in the cafe, reviewing expensive linen samples while my chest tightened with anxiety. I approved a shade of cream I could not have identified under oath, and then I went back to work. That afternoon, I buried myself in correcting structural measurements on the historic facade. Old buildings, I realized, unlike people, usually tell you exactly where their cracks are. The dinner between our two families the following week was supposed to be pleasant. My mother chose a high-end restaurant downtown and said it would be good to sit together without wedding binders. She also planned to ask about the seating chart because I had finally broken down and told her the full, humiliating story. I warned Julian in the car ride over. My mother may bring it up. Why does your mother need to be involved in our seating plan? He snapped. Because your mother is involved in our seating plan. He said nothing. The conversation stayed safe and superficial through most of the meal. We talked about work, the terrible Chicago weather, parking, and a cousin's new apartment. Sylvia asked about my restoration proposal, and when I enthusiastically explained that I might join the lead engineering team, Julian loudly joked that I was already married to my job. So this wedding is just a formality. Everyone awkwardly laughed. Except me. After the main courses were cleared, my mother calmly put down her wine glass. I had one quick question about the wedding seating. She said, her voice polite but firm. Maya mentioned that Julian's former girlfriend is seated at the main family table. Is there a specific reason for that? Sylvia's therapist's smile snapped into place. Chloe has been part of our family circle for many, many years, Helen. I understand that, my mother countered smoothly, but it could be quite confusing for the other guests. Robert chimed in, gruffly stating that anyone who actually knew them understood the relationship. My father pointed out that not every guest at a 200-person wedding knew their intricate history. It should have been an awkward but manageable conversation. Instead, Julian slammed his water glass down on the table so hard the ice spilled over the rim. This is exactly the kind of toxic, outdated thinking I've been talking about, he sneered. My mother blinked, taken aback. Outdated? The idea that people have to hate each other after a breakup? No one is asking anyone to hate her, I interjected, my heart pounding. Then why is this becoming a public debate? Julian demanded. Because you refuse to discuss it privately. Sylvia lifted a calming hand. Let's not accuse each other, please. Her son had just insulted my entire family, but apparently, my time's accusation was the real emergency. My father calmly asked why a former romantic partner was being given a place of ultimate honor at the wedding. She's just sitting at a table, Julian scoffed. With your family, I replied. She is times family to them. Those words hit me harder than a physical blow. My mother looked at Julian and asked, quietly, where exactly does that leave Maya? Sylvia chimed in, there is always room for more than one meaningful relationship in a complex family system. I stared directly into Sylvia's eyes. I'm not asking you to stop caring about her. I'm asking you not to treat her like your son's partner at our time's wedding. Robert insisted no one was doing that. Then move her, I challenged. The entire table went dead quiet. Julian looked absolutely furious because I had finally cornered him, making the request impossible to blur or excuse away. He leaned forward and viciously whispered that I didn't get to dictate whom his parents considered family. I get a say in who sits at the family table at my wedding, I stated. Our wedding, he corrected mockingly. Great, then use your half of the say to fix it. He laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. This is just pure insecurity, Maya. My mother sharply asked him not to speak to me like that. Julian immediately exploded, accusing my family of only caring about superficial appearances and claiming I had aggressively recruited my parents to pressure him. People at nearby tables began turning around to watch the spectacle. I could feel a hot, prickly heat crawling up my neck. I wanted to disappear into the floorboards and flip the table at the exact same time. I am asking you for one boundary, Julian. Just one, I pleaded. He stared at me like I had just threatened to burn down his childhood home. Then, he stood up. He pushed his chair back slowly and stood over the table with the arrogant confidence of someone who truly believed the entire room would eventually bend around him. She is going to be in my family's life, he announced, his voice echoing in the quiet restaurant. Birthdays, holidays, weddings, future celebrations, all of it. Permanently. Robert harshly whispered his name in warning. Sylvia reached out for his arm. He ignored them both, keeping his eyes locked on mine. If you can't accept that, he said, delivering the final, fatal blow, maybe you shouldn't go through with the wedding. The sentence hung violently above the table. Even his parents looked horrified. That mattered. It meant he had finally gone way beyond their usual pretentious language about maturity and family bonds. He had made the choice crystal clear. Chloe's place was permanent. My place depended entirely on my silent acceptance of hers. He stood there, waiting for me to back down. I knew that smug expression. It was the exact look he gave me after every argument when he expected me to apologize for making things unpleasant. Usually, I did. Usually, I softened my voice, promised to work on my insecurity, and called my surrender a compromise. I sat there long enough for him to relax slightly, thinking he had won. Then I looked up at him and said, "You're right." His shoulders immediately dropped in relief. I stood up, picked up my purse, and added, "I shouldn't marry you." Nobody moved. Julian blinked, his smugness evaporating. "What?" I said, "I shouldn't marry you." "Maya, don't be ridiculous," he snapped, panicking. Ridiculous, emotional, insecure, dramatic. All the convenient labels lined up, ready to explain me away. But something deep inside my chest had gone completely quiet. It wasn't calm, exactly. It was more like a massive power outage. The lights were off. The machinery of my anxiety had stopped running. I looked at my parents. "Can we go?" My mother stood up immediately. My father threw a stack of $100 bills on the table with violently shaking hands. Julian stepped around his chair, blocking my path. "You're really leaving because of this?" "No," I said, looking right through him. "I'm ending the wedding because of this." Sylvia frantically told us to sit down because emotions were highly dysregulated. Robert loudly declared everyone needed to cool off. Julian laughed nervously and told me we would talk at home when I stopped performing for my parents. That disgusting sentence followed me all the way through the restaurant and out the heavy glass doors. Outside in the cool night air, my mother reached for me, but I stepped away because I knew if she touched me, I would completely collapse. I said I didn't want to discuss it in the parking lot. In the car ride home, nobody spoke for several blocks. Finally, my mother turned around from the front seat. "About what, honey?" "The way he talks to me. The way they constantly make me feel like I'm crazy." My father looked stricken in the rearview mirror. "I should have stopped him tonight. I'm so sorry." "You tried," I said. "Not hard enough," my mom said, crying. She confessed they had been terrified that pushing too hard would make me defend him and pull away from them. She wasn't wrong. I had spent years translating his terrible moods, justifying Sylvia's passive-aggressive comments, and explaining away my parents' concerns. Admitting they were right would have forced me to act. When I walked into my house, the stacks of expensive, gold-foiled wedding invitations were sitting right by the door. The venue deposits, the caterer, the custom dress, the guest list, it all hit me like a freight train. My mother gently asked whether I was absolutely sure. I sat on my sofa, burying my face in my hands. Yes, I wasn't sure how I would survive the next week, but I was absolutely certain I was not marrying Julian. After my parents left, I pulled out my phone and called Claire, the wedding planner. It was late, but she answered on the second ring. "The wedding is cancelled," I said, my voice hollow. She was quiet for a second. "Maya, are you safe?" That single question almost broke me. I told her yes. There had been no physical violence, just a humiliating public ultimatum and a brutal moment of clarity I would have vastly preferred to experience before paying $30,000 in non-refundable deposits. She asked whether I wanted everything paused or formally cancelled. "Cancel it all. Anything in my name, cancel it immediately. Do not authorize any new payments on my cards." I opened my laptop and aggressively made a spreadsheet, because apparently, that is exactly how architects have nervous breakdowns. Venue. Caterer. Photographer. Florist. Vintage furniture rentals. I marked the massive amounts, the deadlines, and whose signatures were on what. The cold, practical math kept me from thinking about the fact that I had ended my 5-year relationship less than 2 hours earlier. My phone rang incessantly. Julian. Sylvia. Robert. Then, a text message popped up from Chloe. Before answering anyone, I walked upstairs to get clean clothes and saw my custom wedding dress hanging in the guest room closet. I unzipped the garment bag just enough to see the beautiful ivory silk, then zipped it back up so fast the zipper caught and tore the fabric. I was not ready for the dress to become a crime scene. It had been meticulously altered, paid for, and cried over by the women in my family. Now, it just looked like a very expensive accusation. I looked at my phone. Chloe's text read, "Is it true the wedding was cancelled?" I typed, "Why are you asking me?" and deleted it. Then I typed, "Congratulations, you won." Deleted that, too. Finally, I just put the phone face down. Around midnight, I heard Julian's key in the front door. He walked in and found me sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by highlighted vendor contracts and my laptop. "Are you seriously canceling the vendors right now?" he demanded, looking bewildered. "Yes. You didn't even wait for us to talk. We talked at dinner, Julian." "That wasn't a real conversation," he yelled. "It was real enough for you to explicitly tell me not to marry you." He threw his hands up, pacing the kitchen. "People say stupid things when they're angry, Maya. You stood up to say it. You wanted an audience." He paced furiously, accusing me of humiliating him and embarrassing his parents in public. He ranted about the lost vendor deposits and the family gossip for 10 minutes before he finally stopped and asked whether I was hurt. When I pointed out his priorities, he scoffed. "Of course I know you're hurt. Then admit what you did." I defended my family. "You chose your ex-girlfriend's permanent place in your life over our marriage." "That is not what happened." "It is exactly what happened." For a brief, agonizing moment, he sat down at the table and buried his face in his hands, and I saw the man I had loved. The man who made me coffee before early meetings, who fixed the sticking back door, who held my hand for hours in the waiting room when my father had heart surgery. Bad relationships are not made entirely of bad moments. If they were, they would be easy to leave. He could be so incredibly tender, yet he could still make me doubt my own sanity whenever my basic needs inconvenienced him. He begged me to sleep on it before making anything final. I told him the cancellations had already been processed. "You really did this?" he whispered, looking at me like I was a monster. I almost apologized. The instinct was so deeply ingrained in me. Instead, I looked at him and said, "You showed me exactly what my future would look like. I finally believed you." He slept in the guest room. I lay awake in our bed, listening to him shift behind the drywall. Update. 2. Before sunrise, Claire sent the contract summary. 10 minutes later, Robert called me. He didn't ask how I was doing. He began immediately with the money. "Do you have any idea what this impulsive cancellation is going to cost?" he barked. I stood in my kitchen, holding an empty coffee mug. "Good morning to you, too, Robert." He aggressively listed the deposits, the catering penalties, and the floral balances, then explicitly threatened to speak with his lawyers. I calmly told him I would honor any contract my name was legally on, and absolutely nothing more. I also sharply reminded him that his son was the one who issued the ultimatum in front of both families. "That doesn't give you the right to create catastrophic financial damage," Robert growled. "It gives me the right not to get married." A few hours later, Sylvia called with her softer, far more dangerous approach. "Maya, major life decisions made during a state of emotional flooding can feel very certain in the moment, but they often lack perspective," she cooed. "Please don't diagnose my breakup, Sylvia. I'm not diagnosing you. You're using clinical language to avoid admitting you don't know what you want." She begged me to allow space for repair. I told her that repair would have required her son to respect my boundaries. Before I ended the wedding, she suggested couples counseling. "For what?" I asked. "To negotiate exactly what percentage of my marriage belongs to his ex-girlfriend." She called me unfair. I hung up. That evening, Julian entered the house and found 2 large suitcases packed and sitting by the stairs. "What the hell is this?" he asked. "Clothes, work things, medication, chargers. I didn't go through anything private." "You packed my stuff?" "Some of it. I need you to stay with your parents while we arrange the rest of your move." "You can't throw me out, Maya. I live here. The house is legally mine." He stared at me as though my ownership of the property was a tactical ambush. It wasn't. I had bought the house long before meeting him. His name was never on the deed. He contributed to utilities and groceries, but never the mortgage. He sat heavily on the couch. "I'm not leaving tonight." My heart pounded, not because I feared physical violence, but because I knew exactly how easily I could be worn down if he stayed. One tearful apology, one night of him holding me, and I might start bargaining against my own sanity. "Then my parents are coming over right now," I said, pulling out my phone. "You're bringing them into this again? They were present when you offered me a breakup. They can be present for the move out." He called me a cold, heartless bitch. I told him cold was the only temperature at which I could currently function. We went in exhausting circles for an hour until he finally grabbed one suitcase. At the door, he turned and sneered, "You really think you can just shut me out this fast?" For once in 5 years, I didn't soften my answer. "Watch me." The heavy door slammed closed. I locked the deadbolt, slid down against the wood, and cried so violently I scared myself. The narrative began changing almost immediately. At first, people only knew the wedding was cancelled. Then, mutual friends sent careful texts making it obvious they had heard a very different story. "I heard this was all about your extreme jealousy. He says you demanded his family cut Chloe off completely. Are you okay?" According to Julian's revised history, I had become unhinged and obsessed with his ex, and demanded his parents erase her from existence, and cancelled the wedding in a fit of hysteria when they refused. The restaurant ultimatum magically disappeared from his version. I felt deeply humiliated. I had to cancel dress fittings and explain to my firm why my honeymoon leave was no longer needed. I hid in the office bathroom stalls because the pity of my co-workers was somehow harder to survive than the vicious gossip. 2 weeks after the restaurant disaster, Chloe reached out and asked to meet. She said there were things I deserved to know and suggested a public coffee shop. My therapist advised against it. I went anyway, because ending a toxic relationship had not magically turned good judgment into my strongest personality trait. She was already sitting at a booth. She looked tired, which deeply annoyed me. I wanted her to look smug and evil so I could hate her efficiently. She got straight to the point. She swore they had never slept together during our relationship. But, she added, stirring her coffee, "I know I crossed emotional boundaries, and I know he let me." I waited. She revealed that after I canceled the wedding, Julian had gone straight to her apartment, angry and confused. He told her that maybe everything happened for a reason, heavily implying he wanted to get back together. She asked him what he wanted. He said he didn't know. She rejected him, telling him she refused to be his backup plan just because I finally stopped accepting the disrespect. Then, he blamed her. He told her that her constant involvement had ruined his life. She reminded him that times he had encouraged it. "What do you mean, he encouraged it?" I asked, my chest tightening. Chloe looked at me with pity. "The wedding seating chart, Maya. He told me I would be at the family table. He said his mother handled the seating. She made the chart, yes, but Julian told me weeks before the dinner that I was staying at that table, and that he would make sure you eventually accepted it." I felt sick. He had sat beside me in the planner's office, pretending to be uncertain and frustrated with his mother, while privately assuring Chloe she wasn't moving. He was playing both of us. He built his entire confidence around my deeply ingrained habit of returning to peace no matter what it cost my soul. Chloe admitted she had held on to hope that if she stayed close enough to the family, Julian might return to her. But seeing him lie to both of us broke the illusion. She showed me his text messages. He had written to her, "Maya is just spiraling about the seating chart. My mom won't move you. Don't worry, she'll calm down. She always does. She always does." That line hurt more than the lost money, the lost years, and the lost wedding combined. I thanked Chloe for the truth, told her I still didn't forgive her for her role in my misery, and left. Armed with this new information, the dynamic shifted. Chloe sent the screenshots of Julian's two-faced manipulation directly to Sylvia. The perfect family imploded. Sylvia called me a few days later, her polished therapist persona completely shattered. She admitted she had seen the texts and realized her son had been lying to everyone to maintain his comfortable harem. "I am so sorry, Maya," she cried. "Is there any chance of reconciliation now that the truth is clear?" "The truth makes me infinitely less likely to return, Sylvia," I said. "You knew I was uncomfortable for years, and you used your clinical vocabulary to gaslight me into thinking I was the problem. You protected your family's arrangement at my expense." I hung up and blocked her number. The financial threats eventually vanished. I paid the contracts in my name, Robert paid the ones in his, and Claire recovered a surprising amount of the deposits. Nobody sued anyone. It just quietly ended. Once the immediate disaster settled, I threw myself into my work. The restoration project of the old Art Deco building became my lifeline. I stopped editing myself to accommodate a man's fragile ego. When a contractor tried to use cheap, modern materials to patch the historic facade, I publicly tore his argument apart with structural facts and forced him to do it right. Driving home that day, I realized I had engaged in a tense conflict without apologizing for existing. It felt revolutionary. Months later, I reconnected with an old friend who introduced me to a woman named Elena. On our first date, Elena mentioned a close friend from her office. My trauma reacted before my brain did. "Have you ever dated her?" I snapped, my tone razor sharp. Elena looked surprised but didn't flinch. "No, never." I immediately panicked, apologizing profusely, expecting the familiar lecture about my toxic insecurity. Elena just smiled gently. "It's okay to ask, Maya, you can ask, and I can answer. That's how this works. No diagnosis. No gaslighting, no telling me I was crazy. Dating Elena didn't instantly heal me. Trust returned in tiny, boring pieces. It looked like a delayed text message that was actually just a delayed text message, not a secret meeting with an ex. It looked like expressing a boundary and having it respected immediately, without a debate. A year later, my architectural restoration project was finally approved. I sat in my living room, looking at the blueprints spread across my dining table. The same uneven oak floors, the same stubborn cabinets, the same house that had once been filled with wedding boxes and absolute terror. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Elena. Saturday or Sunday for the museum? There was no hidden subtext. No secret family arrangement. No manipulation to decode. I smiled, typed, "Saturday is perfect," and went back to my blueprints. I had finally rebuilt my own foundation, and this time, there were no hidden cracks. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out and allows us to bring you even more awesome stories. Thank you so much for watching.